Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. My name is Regina Yao, and I'm the president of the Pixel Project, and I'm moderating the fifth Read for Pixels panel session in a series of live stream panel sessions with the authors and editors held as part of the launch of our first ever charity anthology, Giving the Devil His Due. This panel is also part of the Pixel Project's program for the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, which has just kicked off on the 25th of November 2021. So this anthology is part of our Read for Pixels program, through which we work with award-winning best-selling authors to raise awareness and funds for our work to end violence against women and girls. Today's YouTube session is also our 10th Read for Pixels live stream author panel. The Pixel Project created these multi-author panel sessions to be an accessible resource for writers interested in writing about female characters and approaching themes such as misogyny, sexism, gender, and violence against women with depth, empathy, and accuracy. And what better topic for our anthology panel session series than best served cold, the catharsis of revenge for violence against women in speculative fiction. So, here to participate in today's discussion, or this evening's discussion, are one of the acclaimed speculative fiction authors who have all contributed wonderfully cathartic stories to our anthology, and the founder of the publisher of our anthology. Now, right at the bottom is Leanna Renee Hieber. Or is it Hieber, Leanna?
It's Hieber, yeah.
Yeah, Hieber. Leanna is the best-selling author of the historical fantasy novels for Tor and Kensington Books, such as the Strangely Beautiful Saga, the Eterna Files trilogy, and the Spectral City series. A classically trained actress featured in film and television, Leanna created and tours a one-woman show portraying 19th century designer Clara Driscoll. And next to me is Lisa Kastner. Lisa is the founder and executive editor of Running Wild Press. She's been a writer and editor for more than 20 years. She has an MFA in creative writing with concentrations in fiction and nonfiction from Fairfield University. Lisa began Running Wild with the belief that we can change the world through story. And Running Wild is our partner publisher for the charity anthology. Now, you, the audience, will also be able to ask them questions live. Just make sure that you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of this YouTube screen. And Anusha Kandasivam, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me to read out to Leanna and Lisa to answer. And for those of you who are interested in getting your very own copy of Giving the Devil His Due, you can order it from major booksellers worldwide, including Amazon, Kobo, Google Play, Book Depository, and more. All net proceeds go towards keeping the Pixel Project's campaigns, programs, and initiatives, such as this one, alive and kicking. And now onwards to the panel session. So we'll start with a quick introduction to the topic that we are going to chat about today. So revenge is a classic literary plot device and theme that has been the staple of speculative fiction, including science fiction, fantasy, and horror. We see it in stories throughout the centuries and cultures, from the Greek myths to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to the Twilight Zone. It is so ubiquitous and effective a master plot that it is even built into the core of certain genres or subgenres such as horror, wuxia, and epic fantasy. Now, one of the reasons why revenge stories are popular are because they are cathartic. They allow the reader to safely and vicariously experience retaliation through fiction and to root for wrongs to be righted and for the wronged to be avenged when justice cannot be had in the real world. Indeed, this is one of the reasons why we have decided to make revenge the major theme of our charity anthology, to help readers understand via alternative fictional worlds and realities the urgency of fighting for justice for victims of gender-based violence in real life. Yet the theme of revenge is a double-edged sword, because stories of vengeance have also generated a number of controversial tropes commonly seen in speculative fiction and wider pop culture. Some, like women in refrigerators or fridging as we all call it, are blatantly sexist and misogynist. Others, like the avenging woman, often walk a fine line between empowering the female survivor and portraying her as a monster of sorts. With all that in mind today's panel session will be discussing the popularity and the role of revenge stories in speculative fiction and wider pop culture, the role of revenge fiction in social justice, and whether or not this can help move conversations about sexism, misogyny, and violence against women forward in a constructive way. Now, the enduring popularity of revenge stories in speculative fiction is evident in the lists on Goodreads and conversations on Reddit Fantasy, where readers routinely ask for recommendations of books containing satisfying tales of revenge. The vengeance narrative is also part and parcel of many hit movies, ranging from John Wick to Promising Young Woman. So, let's begin with Leanna. In your opinion, why are revenge stories so evergreen and popular, not just in science fiction, fantasy, and horror fiction, but also throughout pop culture storytelling?
Well, I think you hit on the classic nature of it, Regina. I think that the fact that these stories go back to no matter what culture you have, the most ancient texts that anyone has, there are themes of revenge because it is something that people feel that they need to act when something has happened to them. We see it a lot of times in terms of family dramas and family sagas, and so especially when you're looking at some of the classic stories of whether it's Shakespeare or something from any corner of the world, the idea of trying to restore something, whether it's the throne, whether it's dignity, that revenge idea is so powerful because I think it's very relatable. I think we all can feel what that emotion is. No matter who you are, you've experienced something that has been unfair, and the idea of getting back at that person who wronged you or that situation that wronged you. Revenge isn't necessarily something just for a person. Sometimes it's towards a system. But then you run into some problems with that, as we'll talk about that. But I think it's just the general universality of it, that all of us have a very deep and sometimes not necessarily nuanced need to fix something that has been broken, or to sort of eye for an eye about any given situation, whether or not that's the right move or not. Well, that's what this anthology can be a part of that discussion, because I don't think there is any right or wrong way to deal with this topic. We just have to talk about it.
Lisa?
Yeah, and I completely agree with Leanna. I mean, and actually think about this, right? Some of the most classic tales that are in our educational system, like Beowulf, like Hamlet, like Wuthering Heights, are all about revenge. I mean, I still remember when I first read The Count of Monte Cristo, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is my most favorite thing ever. I think I read it like 3 times, right, in the course of a summer. And when you look back on it, it's like, especially during your teen years and your preteen years, you're experiencing so many things that feel wrong, right? Whether they are or not, they probably are, but having that available to us, having those texts where we can go back and look at them and say, someone else feels this, someone else has gone through this, and you don't feel alone. That is tremendous. That is such a tremendous gift. So it is that catharsis. And it's also that, again, that feeling of, I'm reading something about revenge, about someone else who had this exact same emotion. And holy moly, this means that not only am I not alone, but there's a greater world out there that has a greater understanding of what's happened to me personally.
Yeah. So Do y'all think that the way that revenge stories are told has changed over the centuries or the years? And if so, how, Leanna?
I do think they've changed. I think that there's a lot more. I do think there's a lot more nuance in how stories are being told, and whether it's in fiction or in film. When you think about, this topic, makes me think of the film Parasite, which I think is one of the best movies ever made. I think it's an incredible film. It's dealing with class struggle. It's dealing with there is certainly death and murder and revenge in that narrative, but it's so complicated. And you are on a roller coaster of emotions, and you have no idea where you think that film is starting as to where it ends. Is like this. I don't think I've ever been on a cinematic journey quite like that film. So I feel like, when we start to really appreciate how narratives from different cultures, as we are a global society and as we're trying to continue to diversify narratives in publishing, lifting up these different stories, we can start to see different nuances because the cultural background is going to be different and the class background is going to be different. All of these things that might not be how a United States narrative would take this. I love seeing how other cultures and other just people from different backgrounds and different viewpoints, different orientations, different identities are coming at this incredibly nuanced and complicated and often violent topic. And so for me, I think it's a really exciting time because we have access now globally to so many more viewpoints and information. One of the reasons I do like social media, it can be overwhelming, but I get to follow voices from all around the world and see how they're grappling with these narratives and in real time. Certainly, letters could have been shared, hundreds of years ago, but the time it takes to be able to have that culture, those exchanges, we're in such a much more vital time right now, and a really exciting time right now. So I do think that because the world is increasingly complex, and it always has been in its own way, but our ability to respond to those complexities is a lot more swift. I think that we're just seeing a lot more layers to what's already a complicated situation. Because revenge, in and of itself, yes, it might be satisfying, but are you then, if you are taking vengeance into your own hands, if it's a vigilantism, are you then going to suffer consequences on the other side? And will that be justified? Because you may think you're justified, but there's other factors in play that others may not think you're justified in taking that revenge. So it's a constant discussion where power dynamics are in play as well. So the more that we can have a nuanced and respectful discussion about these things worldwide, I think the more rich our stories are going to continue to be.
Okay. Lisa?
Oh, I totally agree. And it's interesting too because the revenge stories today are much more realistic, even those that are of speculative fiction, than they were, hundreds of years ago, in part because if you think about it, the gift of the general public being able to read is relatively new. If you think, at one point, really, within at least the Catholic, those who follow more of like the Catholic and Christian faith, it was really only those who were within that system who could read. The gift, it was, the priests and the preachers, they were the ones who could read. It wasn't the general public. It wasn't those who were in attendance at church. It wasn't those of faith who could read. This all became more widespread only in the last couple of 100 years. So this gift of catharsis through reading is truly a relatively new gift. And I'm sure that's probably true in other countries and in other faiths as well. And back to Leanna's point around, the nuance of the stories today, even if you look at specifically our anthology, there's such a wide variety, a wide array of revenge stories within it that branch anything from the husband, the abusive boyfriend, and it goes into variations that we don't often necessarily talk about, like the professor who's supposed to be a mentor and an advisor who is overtly being sexually abusive, right, to that student, to that up and coming professor. We don't talk about these things. And it's so important to have it come forward within story. And it's even more important that within our anthology, all of our amazing authors gave us the generous gift of the story behind the story, why they wrote about this, why this was important to them, what influenced them to write it, so that when readers come forward and they read these stories, they say, again, not only is this catharsis, but oh my gosh, I'm not alone. I can move forward, right? I can do something about this.
Yeah, and it needed to be complex because violence against women is a really complex issue. And taking, and as Leanna said, you got to look at, does taking revenge also have consequences? Does it? Yes, it does. Might not be visible consequences. You might, but I will say this: I still love the line. I saw my enemy running, screaming down the ravine.
Yeah, that's how my story starts. Yeah, no, I mean, it was very cathartic to me because my story deals with basically a psychic matriarch who's been with me for 11 books now, Evelyn North Stewart. And here you learn her maiden name and you find out what happened to her in her youth. And she kept that from me as a character. She kept that from me for years and years and years. And I knew there was something she didn't want to talk about. And so when the call came out for this anthology, there was a moment in one of my books where she reacted very, very strongly to another woman who was going to be institutionalized against her will. And the way that she reacted, that told me what I needed to know. I mean, I've been with these characters so long that they're friends of mine in my mind. And so they have lives of their own. And in that, that catharsis of her being in a terrible situation, which unfortunately happened to a lot of women in the 19th century. And as we were talking about before the show, is still happening in things like conservatorship. When we're talking about Britney Spears being kind of held captive against her will, these things, they may not be the grim asylums of the 19th century, but there's ways in which these prisons and systems of prisons are still happening around the world. So I definitely think when we think about the taking action, we have to be also looking at the systems, because in the case of the story that I wrote, they're able to get away with those who take revenge in the situation are able to get away with it, but only because there's been some proof and evidence of wrongdoing. So there does have to be a lot. These are complicated situations where I had to make sure when I was writing this that it wasn't just okay, they've acted without there being some recourse to then protect themselves on the other side of this, because that is true that there's just because you might be in the right, there's still going to be a follow-on, very often a legal follow-on. A historic note that would have been in play towards the end of the 19th century, there was such a problem of institutionalizing women and people in general that did not need to be institutionalized, that there's actually an advocacy firm created, a legal fund and a legal resource that was created to prevent unlawful internment. So there was but again, there had to have been a problem for it to get to that point where there needed to be this whole society founded to prevent unlawful and unjust asylums. But it's historically, things are very, very complicated. I wanted to present something that was talking about an institution, because those can also have abuses, not just a single person. And yes, of course, it's spearheaded by a person running this institution. But I think that we, in talking about these things as a larger picture, we do need to be thinking about institutions that are allowing certain abuses to continue to perpetuate. So that for me was a way to fold into, I wanted to continue to work with a character that I knew and loved, that my readership knows and loves, and that has some investment in it. And then also to share a bit of historic fact, and then have us look about, are we still doing this today to people? Yes, in many ways we are.
Yeah, and that's how it changes, right?
Mhm.
The story, the patterns of the revenge story change according to how these types of abusers evolve over time.
Well, and it's also our society, right? Our society for centuries, even if there was proof that this woman was abused, even if there was evidence, whether our society would acknowledge it or not is a completely different story. I mean, there are tons of cases where the perspective of even the jury, the judge, oftentimes the police, right? It doesn't even get to judge or jury. The police just say, you know what? I don't know why you're reporting this, because this is you're his wife, or you're his sister, or you're his daughter. This is just life, right? All right, good to see you, and it's never reported. And I would not be surprised if that didn't still hold true in certain areas of the world. I would actually be shocked if that was not still true.
Oh yeah, it's true. I mean, over here in Asia, if you go to the police station and try to file a report, they're gonna say that to you.
That's right.
Oh, so we have a comment from the audience. A couple of comments from Andreas. Actually, I'm just going to show them. So Andreas said, before John Wick, there was Salma Hayek and Everly. And he said, Oleana by David Mamet deals with this possibly abusive power dynamics between professor and student.
Good point.
Yeah. So now let's talk about, do you think there is a difference between stories of revenge and stories of justice, Leanna?
Yes, because revenge tends to directly involve the person that was victimized somehow. Whereas justice is usually part of a system, part of a judge, a jury, a possible arrest, a possible trial. Can revenge feel like justice? Yes, but it's outside that system. And so I think that revenge tends to have, it to me carries a connotation of violence. Whereas justice doesn't necessarily carry a connotation of violence. So for me, there is sort of an eye for an eye aspect of revenge, whereas the concept of justice is more of a system, and also then possibly a sentence. So vigilantism versus the legal process, maybe that's a differentiation. Does revenge feel, do revenge stories serve as that catharsis of justice? Absolutely. So I think I think these two things are completely tied together, but I do think that they have a different course. They run a different course, as it were.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to pause a bit and just say, if you hear the dog barking do you both hear the dog barking or not?
I hadn't heard it.
Okay, good, because I can hear him, and if you can't hear him, that means we are good.
Yeah.
He's not gonna. I'm pausing it and telling everyone in the audience, I'm so sorry if you hear him. I can't leave this running while going and telling him to be quiet. He's just gonna continue. He's a tiny little. Lisa's seen him. He's a tiny little.
He's
furball
adorable, but he
with
has
a
a
big
big mouth.
voice, which is why I'm asking if you can hear him, because he is protesting because I kicked him out of the room. So, all right. So let's continue. So, Lisa, do you think there's a difference between stories of revenge and stories of justice?
I think in part it depends on how we're defining justice and revenge, and it's also situational. which I think, ties exactly back to everything Leanna was just saying. I do think that justice they both can be each other, right? Again, there's this interweaving. Interestingly, I was reading something actually I was reading the Just Us League in our anthology, and so my mind immediately went to that and thought, well, wait a minute. I guess like even in the DC Comics version of the Justice League, right? There's a little bit of revenge in there. So, I do think that overall, generally speaking, our society does have an inference that justice, like that's what's right and how things were supposed to be. And revenge has this like dark, sinister feeling just behind the word. Whether that's right or not, or how, the true definition of each word is intended to mean, I don't know. But I'm going to bet there's a lot of our own current day emotions being tied into how we're actually using those words. So that was a huge cop-out answer. And yes, you can go ahead in the comments and curse me out. It's all good.
So a major revenge trope is the avenging woman or the vengeful woman figure, which has been around for a long time in horror movies and fiction. But it has also, she has also appeared in science fiction and fantasy. So such stories usually feature a female protagonist using her skills to retaliate against male violence in a variety of inventive ways when justice is not available. In the age of Me Too, the hashtag Me Too, such stories have gained enthusiastic audiences and readers and accolades. However, one criticism leveled at the avenging woman trope is that the violence used by the female vigilante to punish male perpetrators is, and I quote this person, blindly imitating toxic male violence as a form of revenge, and is therefore a form of internalized patriarchy and superficial justice. So what are your thoughts on the avenging woman trope? Do you think it's a harmful stereotype that perpetrates the idea that women who fight back are deviant, or do you think female vigilantes can be positive examples of pushing back against misogyny and violence against women? Leanna?
It's such a complicated thing because I personally, come from a pretty pacifist background. But at the same time, I don't believe in being passive when it comes to injustice or violence against women or any such abuse of power. So I think that for me, whereas I do think that there is a problem of basically a cycle of violence. I don't think that this perpetrating and continuing the perpetual cycle of violence is helpful. Do I think people should defend themselves if they're being attacked? Absolutely, I do. So, this also then requires for me a lot of context in how I would approach this as a storyteller, and what my thoughts are as an audience member. Sometimes you have to take on the language of the oppressor in order to be heard. And so is that always the answer? No. But until there's sort of a breakthrough in the power dynamics in and of itself, there's going to have to be some of that. The idea that women need to continue to be seen as people, that our existence and our rights and the rights to our own bodies are a constant source of discussion and debate by people who are not of our gender identities, and so the idea of autonomy, I truly believe that that everyone should have autonomy and the rights to their own bodies and their inalienable rights to live as they are without threat of state violence against them one way or another, let alone interpersonal violence. So the vengeful woman, I think there's a place for her, because I don't want people to think that you can just get away with violence and that there's just going to be pacifism, that it would just be met with acquiescence. I don't think that that's right, nor is that helpful. Are the ways in which we can creatively push back as a society against oppression and violence? Yes, absolutely. Continue to be creative, but we need every tool in our toolkit for that. And so it's, for me, it's never, none of these responses are ever going to be a blanket statement, because for me it's always going to be contextual, and it's always going to change from one situation to the next.
Lisa?
Agreed. And what's really interesting to me about that comment regarding the revengeful woman trope, let's all take a moment and sit back and think about, when was the last time you actually knew a woman in real life who beat the crap out of a guy and got away with it? I mean, I'm intentionally having a pause here because I do want everyone to just reflect on that. The reality, to Leanna's point, is that most women are raised to be passive. And even when we do come forward, and it doesn't even have to be a physical fight back, it can be a verbal fight back. Oftentimes the perception is like, who are you? How dare you speak back to me in this capacity? I mean, when I was a teenager, when my friends and I would go to clubs, oftentimes my friends would be approached by men who were very aggressive. And because, again, we're taught not to respond in an aggressive manner, imagine me physically getting between this very aggressive male who's insisting that he have my friend's phone number, or that she go into the corner with him to make out, or whatever other thing you want to think of, including like cars, and getting in between them and saying, when she said no, that's what she meant, and you need to leave. And we were honestly just really, I don't want to say lucky, but in some ways lucky, that we happen to have male friends who would back me up when I backed up our friends. That is not the common behavior, right? And because that's not what's common, that's what makes this that much more important to be in fiction. But it's also important that it is nuanced, so that it isn't coming across as some type of cliche, right? Some type of broad generalization, so that when someone reads it, they say, oh, this is just some chick who's, acting, very male, or whatever the case may be. It needs to have that additional context, so that when it is read, individuals see it and say, oh, wait a minute. Oh, I get it now. Okay, this makes sense to me. I understand why this female, even if it's a character, is actually fighting back, right? I understand why this situation is wrong.
Yeah, I think we need to, as a society, really recognize that there needs to be consequences for actions. But we've all, I mean, anyone who identifies as female has had a situation where we feel like we can't win, no matter what we say or do in response to someone. If we're nice, then it's seen as being encouraged to go further. If we do push back, then that becomes escalatory of negativity, even towards violence. So there really is a you can't win scenario for a lot of women in a lot of different situations, across all kinds of things.
Agreed.
So that's where, really continuing to explore in fiction the idea that no, there are consequences for your actions. Just because the power dynamic is one way does not give you license. And also, too, listen to a woman. When she says no, she means no. And the idea of just listening to women, and that we have boundaries. That's the thing. Women's boundaries are being tested all the time. And so this anthology is a discussion of boundaries as much as anything, and how to maintain them, and how to really allow for readers to empathize, no matter what your background is, no matter what you're coming from. Reading creates empathy. So we hope as authors of these stories that you can empathize with these characters and maybe examine the different struggles and power dynamics in your life, and how can you make sure you're not perpetuating these same problems in your life.
Exactly. Yeah. And another thing that's gorgeous about many of these stories is that our authors are leveraging the narrative arc to really punctuate the fact that women, we don't say no once. We don't fight back once. It's numerous times. And that's real. And it's necessary to punctuate that within the narrative arc so that people really get an understanding that, I mean, I may not say no, the literal word no, over and over, but me saying, you know what, I'm good, thanks a lot. You know what, no, I really am not interested. You know, I'm really busy, I gotta go. Okay, all three of those were no's.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, do y'all think that violence needs to be part of the female vengeance narrative in order for it to feel satisfying, or can we do this with no violence? Leanna?
I tried very hard to make this a without violence story in my case. That's why I turn to the paranormal a lot of times, because for me, I do want to break the cycle of violence. I want that for our society. I want that for our world, to break the cycle of violence. And so for me, the only way that I feel that we can really do that is by what I talked about, which is empathy and really putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So my tool for that revenge is actually empathy. And so I force the abuser to feel everything that was done to the victims. And that's when he runs screaming down a ravine. The violence that happens on after that, after the weight of feeling what it was like to be on the other side of that. That for me, that's my sort of justice. If I had a superpower, it would be if I could choose a superpower, it would be empathy. To give people empathy who don't have it, to force them to see how their actions have affected someone else, and to make them think twice about doing that again. And so in this case, you know, quite truly breaking this person's mind open was very satisfying. And but it is not that was not a violence. That's actually just a sharing. It felt painful, of course, because the violence against the women that this director of this asylum perpetrated was terrible. So you know that, but that's at that point, it's just, you know, you reap what you sow in this case. And so being able to do that in a way where if there is a further violence, he brings it upon himself in the madness that ensues. That's and exit pursued by ghosts, because of course the ghosts are always helpful in my world, and they're not to be trifled with. So I find a way where the paranormal can make it so that there is still a sense of action, and that action has been taken, but that we can break that cycle of violence with that paranormal help. And that for me is, you know, yeah, if I could offer that to to the world, I would gladly do so. So that's, I try to do it in my fiction.
Lisa, do you think violence or no violence?
So sadly, I think the reality is that, sure, we can write stories without violence, but to Leanna's point, at least for me, a lot of the purpose of this is empathy. It is understanding. And if someone has an opportunity, someone is an abuser and they don't know they're an abuser. And I'm going to own that I'm sure there are hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of individuals who they were raised in a certain way and they just think, well, this is how it is, and therefore it's totally fine that I'm doing this, right? And they've never actually thought about what they're doing from the perspective of the individual who is experiencing the abuse. If we can publish stories, if readers have an opportunity, if that individual has a chance to read a story and say, oh my God, I did that to my girlfriend yesterday. Or, oh, I'm a professor, I'm not supposed to behave this way. Or, oh, maybe when I'm angry, it's not okay to scream and yell at this person and lock them in a room, or whatever the case may be, right? Even though I'm owning right now, everything I just said to me is so horrific. I can't imagine someone not knowing that this is not okay. But for all intents and purposes, the reality is we need to leverage that violence, and in some cases make it where you're literally cracking someone's skull open, right? So that individuals can then understand that what's happening is not okay, and potentially, hopefully, apply it to their own lives and end that cycle of abuse.
So we talked about the vengeful woman, so let's talk about a male stereotype. So revenge stories have also generated an insidiously sexist and misogynist women in refrigerators trope, popularly known as its shorthand fridging. And that was coined 20 years ago. I'm shocked. That was 20 years ago by Gail Simone. Gail Simone is, for those who are tuned into this and you're not sure who Gail Simone is, she is one of the most, she's one of the foremost comic book writers in the last 2 decades to a quarter of a century. And so this trope, fridging, is very common in speculative fiction, and it's where the harming of a female character is used to kickstart the male protagonist's journey and development as he sallies forth to avenge her rape or murder, usually by inflicting violence on the villain who did the raping or murdering. So, in your opinion, why does fridging remain such a popular shortcut for certain speculative fiction authors when there are so many other motives for revenge that could have been used? Leanna?
It's just a shortcut. And unfortunately, a lot of folks, there is a lot of derivative content out there. And we see it a lot in films. And in, there's the prevalence of cop shows where you have violence almost exclusively against women. Law and Order Special Victims Unit was like, I couldn't watch it because it was just constant violence against women. And some of those characters, the prosecutors and the detectives, are fascinating characters. And really well acted, but I couldn't watch it because it was just relentless. And it just became so much a part of this routine of the show that and we see this in all kinds of different fiction as well, especially if you're dealing with a genre. So genre fiction, uses tropes heavily. I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I am very, very trope heavy in what I do. I'm just very specific about the tropes that I use. And I do not use the fridging trope to kickstart a male arc. I don't think that you should only have a sudden desire to protect someone after they have been hurt. Or I don't think that your pain should exclusively come from the violence being done to someone else. I feel like you should probably already kind of have that in you already. But characters need to grow. I understand that. There needs to be inciting incidents. Absolutely. I just tend to find ways where there are other things at stake, other dangers at stake, that does not have to be a violent thing. It can be a threat of a violent thing. But I try to keep that just sort of mindless. Here, there's a dead body off screen and you know nothing about that person. This happens to all kinds of characters of different marginalizations. It's like there's definitely been a long history of the characters of color or the queer characters or, characters of any different marginalization being the ones that are disproportionately, if you look at sort of the statistics of it, fridged in fiction or on film. And there's been a push since the coining of this. Thankfully that is leveling out some, where it's not quite as as noticeable. And it really definitely, I tend to walk away from a show if it's indulging in those tropes, because I think it is just lazy storytelling. Widen your world building and widen your character depth. So that's my thought about it, is that it's an easy thing, and we as storytellers, none of us are doing anything completely new. We're all using some of the same arc structure of storytelling as since time immemorial, but there are ways we can do that it does not rely on violence as someone's character jumping off point. There's a lot more interesting ways, and less harmful ways, because it becomes a casual thing, and the more that we're casual about violence, the more that it's going to just be a part of the background and not in the foreground to address as a problem.
Lisa?
Oh, I totally agree. It's lazy storytelling. I mean, the reality is that every author, you're trying to figure out what is going to be that first sentence, that first paragraph that will emotionally engage the reader. And this is an easy way to emotionally engage the reader. Have your protagonist in an emotionally vulnerable state where that protagonist's emotion goes off the charts. And one of the easiest way to do that is have someone that they love or care about be murdered, or in dire pain, or somehow severely harmed. And sadly, that means that a lot of authors are then going to use this really lazy trope as a way to get there. So I mean, should we do it? No. Are there hundreds, if not thousands, of other ways to emotionally engage the readers? Yeah, totally. But that doesn't necessarily mean that when an author's on a tight deadline and they've got dozens of other deadlines facing them, they're suddenly going to sit down and say, hey, you know what? I'm being lazy right now by using this trope. Should they? Yes. Hopefully, just this panel alone will kind of make people more aware of it and have them own the fact that it is a lazy trope and that they should kind of broaden their skills. So.
Yeah, I will be talking about that a little later in this discussion. The issue of violence against women has historically been seen as taboo for public discussion. And this is why many advocates and activists talk about what we call the wall of silence around the violence. Ironically, violence against women is also a staple of pop culture, and plot widgets like the rape trope is commonly used to add titillation and to hook audiences and readers. So how can revenge narratives counteract stories and storytelling tropes in pop culture that normalize violence against women as entertainment to the masses? Leanna?
I think it can be used as what I mentioned earlier, which is consequences for your actions. The idea that if these things are being tossed out carelessly and casually into the atmosphere, well, people aren't going to just take it. So, I think in some ways, the idea that violence becomes a bit of a dialogue, whether that violence is then returned, or in my case, whether I find a psychic way to make someone see and pay for basically sort of a I do unto others as they would have done unto you, kind of bouncing back at the abuser. That to me would be my preferable way for everybody to do it. To deal with these things, is for there to be some sort of way to share those perspectives, because I do think that a lot of violence would stop if people would walk in other people's shoes. But I think that the revenge concept can be used as a way to counter what has been casual and say, okay, this has been just tossed out here into our world, whether it's in a small way, derogatory comments, or actual violence. The idea that those boundaries, again, I mentioned that boundaries are tested all the time. The concept of revenge can get us talking about boundaries and respecting them.
Lisa?
It's interesting. I'm going back to the beginning of this question and the culture of silence.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so significant. I think we're getting better. I think having stories like the stories in our anthology enable individuals to say, oh, wait a minute. I know about this. I'm aware of this behavior. Joe is acting weird, or Jane, she's limping for no apparent reason. Whatever the case may be. Anthologies like our anthology enable the reader to see that it's okay to say something. It is necessary to say something. It's necessary to be the friend and come forward and empathize with your friend who is in pain. And to encourage that friend to then say, you know what, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. Now, does that mean she runs out and gets a machete? No.
Well, in Stephen Graham Jones's story, yes, she does go.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
Which is delightful. And again, these things that is an attractive concept. Yes.
Agreed. But hopefully what you'll do is read it, empathize with it, have a catharsis, and then say, I'm now going to call the police, or I'm going to follow whatever, more legal means there are in order to get out of this situation and really turn my life around and know that I'm not a victim. Know that my life isn't horrid, and understand that there are others who care about them. And that breaking that culture of silence is so imperative in so many ways. Again, having it in entertainment in general, in any form of storytelling, is just absolutely necessary. So I love that we're doing it, and we've done it, and we'll continue to do it.
And then also sticking with it then too, because, just because we see this all the time, just because a woman leaves an abusive situation does not mean that she's clear of the danger, because there's so many stories of violence that's committed when someone then goes after her.
Yeah.
So, that's where we have to stay, in talking about the wall of silence. It's also about then how do we continue to support the victims when they have tried to extricate themselves, which is, it's so complicated. And then that danger is not past necessarily. Sometimes it actually increases once people leave an abusive situation. So we have to be willing to continue to talk about it, look at those statistics and realize, oh, the danger is still here. How do we support them on this other side of it? Because just making a decision is not enough.
Agreed. Yeah. And how do we empower them to change so that they can understand and acknowledge where they are emotionally, and enable it so that the next time, whether it's their former, hopefully, boyfriend or husband or professor or boss, whatever the case may be, or someone in the future, like, a new abuser, that they then say, oh, wait a minute, I recognize this behavior. I see what it is, and I don't have to put up with this.
Yeah. And it's going back to that. It's what Leanna said. It's the first 6 months. Usually, the statistics show that it's the first 6 months after leaving your abuser that's the most dangerous. That women get killed during this time, children as well. But a recent study shows it's 18 months, not 6. So it's a good year and a half before you're mostly free and clear of your abuser. Now, there are questions from the audience. So there is a question here. I'm going to put it on. So Misty 306 has just joined us. Hi, Misty. Thanks for joining us. She's one of our regulars, and her question is, shouldn't revenge be separated into immediate versus planned? For example, someone hits you and you hit them back almost as a reflex, over planning for months or years for revenge in
That's a great
storytelling.
point. That's
Yeah.
a great point. And I definitely think that revenge implies planning. I
Mhm.
think that what you're describing here, Misty, is retaliation. You retaliate in the moment. Revenge is definitely a plan. So that's how I would, just in terms of the word choices, that's how I would describe that if in a story. For me, definitely revenge is not in the moment. That's absolutely immediate. It is, like you say, reflexive retaliation, protecting yourself, self-defense. Revenge is a different story.
Yeah.
Completely agree. And also, I mean, but that means too, though, revenge can be like within a few hours of some action, right? Planned, planned does not necessarily mean 2, 3, 4 months, days, right? Planned can be a couple of hours. It can be the next day, just as a slight tweak, but agreed.
Right. Well, and also too, waiting for an opportunity, waiting for a moment as well. I think being ready, as if you're creating a story in which someone is going to take action um, against their abuser, waiting for the appropriate moment, that might be a revenge situation, and that moment might be very quick. But so some of this is a bit of semantics, but
Agreed.
I do think that I do think that those moments that you're describing here do need to be very carefully crafted. And again, you as the author need to make sure you're providing that context for the reader.
Agreed.
Yeah, and all the stories in our anthology, it's all planned.
Mm.
It doesn't matter if it's, I'm gonna do this the next time I get an opening to do this, or I come back. Jason Sanders' story where the protagonist actually returns to where she came from with a plan in mind that has been brewing for eons. So, it's all planned. So, Misty, hope that answers your question. There's a really interesting conversation going on in the YouTube chat, actually, about, revenge versus retaliation now.
Well, also too, for sometimes it also, for me, in my case with my story, Evelyn doesn't think to do the act of offering her pain and suffering to the abuser until she's actually encouraged to do so by a mentor character who comes in for her to help their situation. A very gifted psychic sort of heard the psychic cry, and the ghosts who are attached to my heroine go out and basically, send a distress call and bring this woman in. Evelyn, at my heroine in the rest of my books, has been such a matriarch character. She's been the mentor for so many. I wanted to create that there was a mentor before her that was her mentor. And so there's someone outside that encourages her to give all of the things that you have, collect everything that's been done to you, and psychically put it onto the person who did this to you, so that they can feel what has been done. And so in that case, there's assistance. So in that case, that revenge for the revenge, or in that, for me, I feel like it's almost just an equitable, it's sort of like the justice of the interaction is balancing out in that moment. The reaping and sowing is back and forth at that point. So I feel in that case, like there's a facilitator that's come in. So that's another part that can be in this nuance, in the many different choices that you have as a creator, that we have as authors, to put into this, is that, are you doing this on your own, or are people helping you along the way? Because that's also going to determine how quickly something happens in terms of a resolution of your situation.
Yeah. And so Lisa mentioned, and you mentioned just now, that the fridging trope is like a lazy shortcut. So coming out from that, let's get down to the nuts and bolts of how speculative fiction authors can use revenge to engage with the issue of violence against women. So what are the particular pitfalls that authors who have never attempted to use the revenge trope as a device or theme related to violence against women in their stories What are the particular pitfalls that they will need to bear in mind before they attempt this? Leanna?
I think making sure that your emotional arc for the character is fully developed. You don't necessarily want there to just be action without a sense of why the character is doing what they're doing. So I think spending time with the emotional life of their character at any point is going to help you understand and the reader understand why something's happening. Again, creating that empathy. There's a term called rooting interests, and that's something that's developed early on in a narrative where you have to figure out as a reader, why should I care about this person who is the protagonist of the tale? So be very careful and very particular about what rooting interests you give to your characters, that the audience will then go, oh, okay, I am literally rooting for this character now. And they don't necessarily have to be a likable character. They don't have to be, it just has to be something that's relatable, as well as possible. And also some kind of sense within that relatable emotional arc, you have to have a sense of what your world is. So I think that both setting and character right away, you have to kind of, as quickly as possible without a huge info dump, think about, okay, where is this where are they at? Where are they on their emotional journey? Where are they on their physical journey and psychological journey, and then bring us into that narrative, and make sure as the writer why the story is starting when you start it. Sometimes you're writing a story and you realize, oh, the story doesn't actually start until about 3 chapters in. I had to do that with my very first novel, with Strange and Beautiful. I had 3 whole chapters of prologue. And I realized, no, the story doesn't start until she gets to the school. That's when the story starts. So open when she's going to the school, because all the rest of that was stuff I can just weave in some of her memories and some of her thoughts later in through the narrative. So really decide for yourself when your story starts, and try to give us as rich of an emotional life as possible and a sense of what the world building and the rules of that world are towards the beginning. And then you've got a lot of leverage, and you've built yourself a lot of leeway to then have your readers be willing to see what happens next. The richer and the more detailed about your world right away. You don't have to tell it all in the beginning. Again, that becomes info dump. But the more that the more that's fully realized, the reader will feel like, oh, we've been dropped into a world right now, and no, we want to see what happens next.
Mm-hmm. Lisa?
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, I was just going to basically say, avoid broad generalizations, avoid those cliches. The best way to do that, do your research, right? Interview people, talk to them about their experiences, right? Read stories, read the news, find out how people respond, what their intent was, what their impetus was for whatever their behavior, and then leverage that for your own stories. I mean, that's really the best way to avoid these cliches, these awful tropes.
So, how can speculative fiction authors use revenge narratives to engage with the issue of violence against women in their stories and explore justice for victims without sounding preachy or prescriptive? Because that's one of the hot potato topics that keeps surfacing, in Facebook groups and online conversations about, horror or science fiction or fantasy. And the one complaint that, the more right-wing, I'm going to be very polite now, the more conservative readers grouse about is it's too woke, it's too prescriptive, it's too preachy. So if authors want to use revenge as a tool, as a trope, to engage with violence against women as a theme in their stories, how can they do that without evading all these, being preachy or prescriptive? Leanna.
See, that really comes into a lot of your narrative, the stuff that's not the dialogue, the stuff that's not necessarily the description of the room that they're in, but the narrative, the stuff that you, the writer, share about where this person is. It depends on if you're writing first person or third person. If you're writing in a first person narrative where your character is saying, I am doing this and I am feeling this, in some ways that's a great way to avoid some of the preachy stuff, because it's this person's opinion. You are writing as this person's opinion. I tend to write in third person because I have large casts of characters. And for me, I kind of want to have a little bit of a just slightly objective eye kind of over the proceedings. But I'm in what's known as close third person. So that you're in the point of view of the heroine. So you're in Evelyn's thoughts in my story. You know her, what she's thinking, because I share that with you in the narrative. But she's not saying I am doing this. I'm saying as the writer, I'm saying Evelyn felt this way, did this thing. So if you keep all of the motivations and all of the actions very character focused and very character driven, then you avoid it sounding like you're inserting commentary. You don't want your narrative to sound like you, the author, are putting commentary into the story. Now, some people are just going to see what they want to see about stuff. I have had plenty of reviewers over the course of my over 10 years in publishing. My first book came out in 2009. And some folks, when they see that I have a historical fantasy that features a lot of a discussion about women's rights and a diverse cast of characters, they're saying, well, what are these modern things? Well, guess what? History's always been diverse. So it's historically inaccurate for there to be a solely homogenous group in any kind of major metropolitan city, as my stories are set in. And also, people were talking about feminist issues in the 19th century. So, in some ways, it's like, don't worry about what people are going to say about things, because people are going to take issue with some of your issues. Especially, we're in a very, very tense climate right now. And so there's a lot of hot button issues. You can't worry that you're going to please everybody. You're not going to, not at all. But do your research about things. I don't put in anything into my books that doesn't have a certain historical precedent. The language changes. So, for my trans character in Spectral City, her language is very particular to the 19th century, but it's not as if trans folks weren't around. Trans folks have always been around. Queer people have always been around. People of every identity and every different background, every faith, everyone's always been here. No one was invented just in the modern era. It's just that how we talk about it has all changed. So I think as long as you stay in that character focus and really between character and research, and make sure that the stuff that you're dealing with, also hire sensitivity readers. I hire a bunch of sensitivity readers. If I'm writing outside of my lane, if I'm writing outside of my particular character's ethnicity or faith, then I hire a sensitivity reader. And that will help you too, to make sure that your narrative is going to be doing things that's not going to harm other people, and also is that much more character realistic and well researched.
Yeah, Lisa?
All fantastic points. And just to piggyback a little bit,
yeah,
there's actually a trend right now where a lot of authors are writing stories based on real events. And that is actually a great way to avoid anything from a broad generalization to being preachy, because you're leveraging real events, but you change Boston to New York or whatever, right? And that can help it helps the author really embody that story, and it also helps the author then write it in a more realistic fashion because it happened.
Yeah. So we have come to the final question of the evening, which is, and this has been, everyone who's in the chat box today, who's attending today, they've been having this discussion actually. So what revenge books and films would you recommend to aspiring or current speculative fiction writers to read to see good examples of female characters and violence against women being handled well? Leanna?
I definitely read our anthology because I think that I really do think anthologies are a great way to sample a lot of different authors and their takes on a given premise. So I'm really going to say that for, in terms of your reading, definitely be reading different people's backgrounds, read diversely, and try to just take in as much as you can. In terms of, there's been a couple of films that have been specifically on my mind. I talk a lot about Gothic fiction. Obviously, I'm a Gothic novelist. I love all the stuff set in the 19th century. I think that Guillermo del Toro's Crimson Peak does a fascinating discussion about violence, and does it in a way that there's a heroine who is a victim, but she doesn't fall victim to the helpless Gothic heroine tropes. And I think that's very interesting because it's a very resourceful woman and a very violent woman that you see in two of the main characters. And I think that's very fascinating. I can't say anything further other than the title of this film that's not a spoiler, but this is perfectly suited to this discussion, the film Last Night in Soho. It's brilliant. I think it's really great. And it is a fascinating discussion of this whole thing. And again, I can't say anything else. It's going to be a spoiler. I think films like Parasite that are talking about all kinds of different systems and powers and abuses. I think there's a very fun one is a film called Ready or Not. About a woman who marries into a family and realizes that there's like a Hunger Games kind of game that happens after they've just gotten married. And so even though it's like, sort of a woman trying to avoid being killed, she does it in a way that's both fun and humorous and also very resourceful. So I really like seeing films where we have a lot of really, really resourceful women. So those are just a few off the top of my head.
Yeah. Lisa?
Last Night in Soho, 100%. Sorry, I just had to put that out there. Okay.
Good. Isn't it so perfect for this discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. Our anthology, I mean, I can't stress that enough. I'm not just saying that because it's our anthology. I'm saying it because these truly are fantastic stories. Girl with the Dragon Tattoo is quite enjoyable. If you're not a big reader, watch the film. A classic, Carrie. I mean, Stephen King's Carrie. If you're not, you could almost argue that that's like modern day horror's reinvention of female revenge story. I actually personally love the novel more than the film itself, but hey, I'm sure, I mean, honestly, like I went online because I thought, we don't really have this many revenge stories in our society, do we? And then I just, and then I'm like, holy crud. They're like almost everything I've ever loved is technically speaking a revenge story. So honestly, go online, type in best female protagonist revenge stories, and you will be shocked at the sheer volume that will come forward.
Yeah, which is why I mentioned at the beginning of this session that, I went on Goodreads and the Pixel Project also partners with Our Fantasy on Reddit. And I'm just going to say now that Our Fantasy is a great resource if anyone wants any recommendations. I know Reddit has a bad reputation, but I'm going to assure everyone here who's listening to this that we've partnered with Our Fantasy for almost a decade now. And they have always made their subreddit a really safe space for authors, for readers, for fans. They do not tolerate any violence. They do not tolerate any bullying. So I'm going to say, if you go on Reddit, just lurk. There's so many lists, or you can just start a thread and say, I'm looking for feminist stories of revenge. And though I'm pretty sure they have those lists. And people would chime in. Or you can go on Goodreads and and just type in the keywords. And I was shocked, like Lisa. I'm like, wow, these so many people actually had these lists of revenge. I think there's one that's called Stories of Bloody Revenge. So these are all gory stories of revenge. There are stories of feminist revenge. Any flavor of revenge that you're looking for, go on Goodreads or to subreddit. I think NPR might have. I'm not sure.
I'm sure.
They actually
I'm
did
sure.
a list. But they have lists as well. And I'm going to just put this on. So our trusty producer Nusha just shared the link to the subreddit to our fantasy. Look for there for lots of great recommendations. And I'm also going to say, if you're looking for short stories, there are a lot of influences behind the anthology. One is the Twilight Zone, not the new ones, but if you can if you can watch, I think it's available on Netflix. The original black and white Rod Serling Twilight Zone. And these are short, they're mostly like 20-25 minutes long. There are a lot of different revenge stories in there. And it's handled the way that the anthology handles it. Mr. Serling and his really first-rate team of writers. I think they include Richard Matheson as well, his team of writers. They come up with so many different ways of telling the revenge story. And also, if you're looking for short stories, Roald Dahl has a story called Leg of Lamb, and I am not going to spoil the ending for you because it is so perfect. You have to read that, and you're gonna burst out laughing at the end. Let's just say that the Leg of Lamb is is a murder weapon that nobody could see coming. The frozen leg of lamb. Yeah. Uh, and it's not what you think it is. Well, it is, but it's not. So we have come to the end of this session. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. Now, if you're new to, if you haven't heard of our charity anthology before, I'm going to share this little slide. This little slide that we have. So if you want it's Christmas is coming up, the year-end holidays are coming up, lots of gift giving, not just Christmas but a whole bunch of other celebrations. If you're interested in getting a copy of the book for someone, please remember that there's a paper supply chain issue that is holding things up, so it's best for you to order the book now if you want a paperback version. And you can get a copy of Giving the Devil His Due from all major booksellers worldwide, including Amazon, Kobo, Google Play, Book Depository, and whatever's local in your area. And if you want to learn more about the anthology, go to bit.ly/Giving the Devil His Due. This is case sensitive, so please take it down. You can take it down exactly and just go there, and there's lots and lots of different resources about the book there. Or you can just go to www.thepixelproject.net, which is our website, and then you can click on campaigns and programs and the drop down menu and just go to Read for Pixels, and you'll see that. And so additionally, we have teamed up with 12 of the 16 authors to offer a special anthology book play for early bird buyers, because this special edition that the cover that you see on the slide, it's only going to be around until May. After that, we're going to the official edition that's coming out in May. This is an early announcement. We're going to be announcing it in January formally. So if you want this really gorgeous, you want a copy of this really gorgeous cover, get it now. Okay, everyone get it now. And one more thing I want to mention is that there are 2 pages, unlike most charity anthologies. As part of our mission, we actually made sure that there are 2 pages of resources for victims and survivors in 205 countries worldwide, tucked in at the back of the book. If you have an ebook copy, you can just flip to the back. You can just go straight to the back, click on the link, and it will take you, if your tablet or your Kindle has has a web browser, it'll take you straight to the resource. If you have a paperback, you can just copy it down and then type that into your search bar, and the resources will come up. And Leanna also has the book plates to give away. And so if you want a book plate, go to bit.ly/giving the devil his due, click on get a book plate and fill in a form with, we do need your address. We do need your address to send the book plate to you. So that's just basically filling in your address. If you fill in your choice of author, and we'll get back to you. So I'm going to stop sharing this now. To find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it, again, go to the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. Now, Lisa and Leanna, now I know Lisa has an announcement to make. Now, Leanna, if you've got anything coming up as well, please, it's time to make announcements. So Lisa, you go first.
Sure. So we actually have an amazing follow-up memoir called Stargazing in Solitude by Suzanne Samples. It is her first book, actually was named among the best of 2019 by Kirkus Reviews. This one so far is coming in as a starred review. It is absolutely phenomenal. You've got to check it out. And with that, Leanna?
So if you like Evelyn as a heroine in this anthology, good news, because she's in nearly all of my books. So, and she's continuing as a character. I can't say no to her. I love her so much. And so I have a new series coming out called The Spirit Suitor, which continues my Spectral City series. So my Spectral City series is a complete trilogy of novels, but I'm doing a spin-off series of novellas with a company called Scribed. So it's scribd.com. So scribd.com. And I'm doing audiobooks with them of a couple new series that I have a futuristic time slip story where a woman is living in 4 different timelines at the same time. And in each timeline, someone's trying to kill her. So she has to get her revenge and evade and save her people. So that was a really interesting one to do. And then, so that's just recently released and available. And The Spirit Suitor will continue with the Spectral City characters. And I'll be narrating those audiobooks, and those will start releasing early next year. So if you follow me on Twitter, my first and second name, so Leanna Renee, is my Twitter handle. That's where I'm most active on social media. I also do have an Instagram with all 3 of my names, Leanna Renee Hieber. I'm on Facebook, but not much. So you'll find me more often on Twitter and Instagram. I do have a writer's resource guide on my website. So if you go to leannarenehieber.com, you will find both on the contact page and the free reads page, I have a writer's resource guide that lists everything that was helpful to me when I was first starting out as a writer.
Okay. Oh, one more question from the audience. It's probably for me. Will there be another volume of the anthology next year? Andreas, putting together the anthology is an extremely intensive process. So we will have the current anthology out until October 2023. And then if it does really well, we will probably put out another one because it'll be under our Read for Pixels program. So Andreas, please help us spread the word to all your friends, your family, your fellow geeks and nerds and readers. Let them know that this anthology is out. Encourage them to buy it. And one more thing I would like to point out is I mentioned that there's a resource at the back of the book. Now, if you have a friend who is experiencing domestic violence, or you have a friend who has been raped or sexually assaulted but is feeling really ashamed and doesn't know how to get help, use the book. This is one of the reasons why we put the book out. You can take the book, gift it to your friend, Christmas, Kwanzaa, all the different, I think there are probably like 16 different year-end celebrations coming up during the holiday season, which involves gift giving. And we would encourage everyone to, if you have a friend who's suffering, buy the book, wrap it up, give it to them as a present, as a gift. You can slip a note in and say, just look in the, go to the back and look on pages, put the page number if you want to, and tell them, just have a look. Or, if your friend is feeling ashamed, just lend her a copy, or give her a copy and put a note there saying, if you need help, just turn to the back. So, just a suggestion for everybody. So we are gonna have to go now. So everyone, please have a great holiday season. And anyone who's watching this, once it's a recording, we hope that this will be useful for you if you're writing a story, or if you want to chat about revenge. Talk if you're a teacher who's teaching a literature class and you want to talk about the topic of revenge. We hope that this session is useful. And so all of us will bid you good day or good night now, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.